I never thought a pair of plain beige curtains would be the thing that pushed me into a courtroom. But life has a funny way of reminding you that sometimes the smallest arguments are really about something much bigger. If someone had walked up to me a year earlier and said, "One day, you'll take your HOA to court over window curtains and expose how they've been targeting homeowners," I probably would have laughed and gone back to watering my front yard. Looking back now, I realized the curtains were never the real problem. They were just the excuse. My name is Daniel Carter, and I live in a quiet neighborhood outside Henderson, Nevada. One of those planned communities where every mailbox looks the same, every driveway is measured to perfection, and every homeowner smiles just enough to avoid a conversation they don't really want to have. When my wife and I bought our little ranch-style house 6 years ago, we weren't chasing luxury. We wanted peace. After 25 years working as a commercial electrician, I'd had enough of noisy job sites, impossible deadlines, and spending more time on rooftops than in my own living room. This place felt different. The porch faced west, so every evening the sunset painted the mountains orange, and my father spent 2 weekends helping me rebuild the old wooden swing that still hangs there today. Every time I sit on that porch, I think about him. Maybe that's why I always tried so hard to stay out of trouble. I wasn't interested in neighborhood politics. I paid my dues on time, kept my lawn trimmed, waved at people walking their dogs, and minded my own business. If the HOA sent out reminders about trash cans or parking rules, I followed them without complaint. I figured that was the price of living somewhere clean and quiet. Then one Tuesday afternoon, everything changed because of an envelope. It was tucked halfway under my front door when I got home from work, crisp white with the association's logo printed in the corner like it was some official government agency. I remember standing in the kitchen with a glass of iced tea while I opened it, expecting another newsletter about landscaping or holiday decorations. Instead, I found a notice informing me that I had violated the community's architectural appearance standards. My violation? The curtains visible through my front windows. According to the letter, they were considered unapproved exterior-facing window treatments, and unless I replaced them within 10 days, I would owe an $800 fine. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it sounded so ridiculous that I couldn't imagine anyone writing it with a straight face. I walked into the living room and stared at those curtains. They were plain tan fabric, the same ones that had come with the house when we bought it. Nothing flashy, nothing colorful, nothing that would make anyone driving by even notice them. My wife looked over from the couch and asked what was so amusing. I handed her the letter. She read it twice, looked at the window, then back at me. "They're kidding, right?" she asked. "I hope so," I said. The next morning I called the community management office, expecting someone to apologize for a clerical mistake. Instead, I reached a property manager named Melissa, whose voice carried that practiced politeness people use when they don't actually intend to help you. I asked a simple question. "Can you tell me exactly which curtains are approved?" There was a pause while she typed something. "All homeowners are expected to maintain exterior visual harmony," she replied. "Right," I said, trying to stay patient. "But where do I find the list?" Another pause. "It's determined by the Architectural Review Committee." "Is there a color chart?" "No." "Photos?" "No." "A written standard?" "The board exercises discretion." I thanked her, hung up, and sat there staring at my phone. That answer bothered me more than the fine itself. Rules are supposed to tell people what they can and can't do. If nobody could explain the rule, how was anyone supposed to follow it? I tried to let it go. Maybe replacing the curtains would be easier. Maybe this wasn't worth the stress. But 3 days later, another letter arrived. This one had bright red lettering across the top. Final notice. The balance had already increased because of administrative fees. Suddenly, my $800 fine was growing before the deadline had even expired. By the end of the week, another envelope appeared, warning that continued non-compliance could lead to additional penalties and legal action. That's when something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger anymore. It was curiosity. Why were they pushing this so aggressively over something so unbelievably minor? That evening, I sat on my porch watching neighbors come home from work. Across the street, I noticed dark navy curtains. 2 houses down, someone had floral drapes you could see from the sidewalk. Around the corner, another family had bright white blinds reflecting the afternoon sun like mirrors. None of them looked anything like mine, and none of them seemed to be rushing to replace anything. I remember thinking, either I'm the unluckiest homeowner in this neighborhood, or I'm not actually being punished for my curtains at all. That thought stayed with me long after the sun disappeared behind the hills. And, before I went to bed, I opened my laptop, logged into the HOA's homeowner portal, and started reading every document I could find. I had no idea that one decision would uncover something far bigger than a disagreement over window coverings. And by the time I discovered the truth, there would be no turning back. The next morning, I filed a formal records request, something every homeowner was supposedly entitled to under the association bylaws. I wasn't asking for anything dramatic, just every violation involving exterior window coverings issued during the previous 5 years. Honestly, I expected them to stall, maybe even deny the request altogether. But about 2 weeks later, a password-protected file landed in my inbox. I made myself a pot of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and started scrolling. At first, it looked like exactly what you'd expect: addresses, dates, violation descriptions, payment status. Then patterns started jumping off the screen. House after house had curtains visible from the street: navy blue, burgundy, white lace, floral prints that looked like somebody's grandmother had picked them out in 1982. One family even had bright yellow blackout curtains that practically glowed every afternoon when the sun hit them. Yet none of those homeowners had received so much as a warning. I thought maybe I was missing something, so I drove through the neighborhood with my phone, taking pictures from public streets. Not to embarrass anyone, not to start trouble, just to compare what I was seeing with what the HOA claimed was unacceptable. By sunset, I had photos of more than 20 homes that violated the exact same rule they were using against me. My own curtains suddenly looked boring compared to half the neighborhood. That's when I went back to the spreadsheet and stopped looking at the curtains. Instead, I started looking at the homeowners themselves. 4 names kept appearing, mine included. 4 citations over 5 years. Only 4. At first it seemed random, until I remembered something from a board meeting 6 months earlier. I had stood up during the homeowner comments and politely asked why landscaping expenses had nearly doubled even though the flower beds looked exactly the same. I wasn't accusing anyone of stealing money. I just wanted to understand where my dues were going. The board president, Linda Mercer, had smiled, one of those practice smiles that never reaches the eyes, and told me financial matters would be addressed at a later date. They never were. Curious, I searched through old meeting minutes and emails I'd saved. Another homeowner, Eric Thompson, had requested copies of vendor contracts. Citation: a retired school teacher named Janet Ellis had asked about reserve fund transfers. Citation: a young accountant named Chris Delgado had questioned legal expenses during an annual meeting. Citation: every single homeowner who had pushed for financial transparency somehow ended up receiving window treatment violations. I leaned back in my chair and whispered, "No way," because even saying it out loud sounded unbelievable. My wife walked into the kitchen carrying laundry, saw the maps and photographs spread across the table, and asked, "You're not really thinking this is connected, are you?" I slid the papers toward her. She spent several minutes comparing addresses before looking back at me. "Danny, I think somebody wanted to send a message." That sentence stayed with me all night. Suddenly the letters, the rush deadlines, the unexplained fees, none of it felt random anymore. It felt personal. A week later, I requested copies of board voting records regarding architectural enforcement. They refused. They claimed attorney-client privilege, which made absolutely no sense because I wasn't asking for legal advice. I was asking how enforcement decisions had been made. Their refusal only convinced me I was walking in the right direction. Through Eric, one of the other cited homeowners, I got the name of an attorney named Michael Brennan, a man who had spent nearly 20 years representing homeowners in HOA disputes across Nevada. His office wasn't glamorous, just a small brick building squeezed between a tax service and a coffee shop, with stacks of legal binders covering nearly every available service. He listened without interrupting while I explained everything from the first letter to the spreadsheet I'd assembled. Then he quietly flipped through the photographs one by one. Every few pages he'd nod to himself like he was solving a puzzle he'd seen before. Finally, he set everything down and smiled. "Mr. Carter," he said, "your curtains aren't the issue." I figured as much. "No," he replied, tapping the spreadsheet with his pen. "The issue is selective enforcement. Associations have authority to enforce rules, but they can't enforce them only against people they don't like. If this pattern holds up in court, they're going to have a very difficult day." For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt like someone was speaking plain English. We spent the next several weeks building the case. Michael had me organize every photograph by street, every violation by date, every board meeting where financial questions had been raised. We even compared satellite images to prove the houses hadn't recently changed their curtains. It became almost obsessive. My dining room looked less like a home and more like an investigation headquarters, with folders covering every chair. Friends joked that I had turned into a detective. Maybe I had, because once you realize someone has been abusing authority, it's hard to stop asking questions. Around that time, neighbors started noticing what I was doing. Some quietly wished me luck. Others avoided eye contact altogether, afraid they might become the next target. One afternoon, an older gentleman named Frank walked over while I was checking my mailbox. He leaned close enough that nobody else could hear and said, "You're not the first person they've pushed around, just the first one who's fighting back." Before I could ask what he meant, he simply nodded and walked away. Those words echoed in my head for days. Maybe this wasn't just about 4 homeowners. Maybe plenty of people had paid questionable fines simply because challenging the board seemed impossible. About a month before the hearing, another certified letter arrived. This one informed me that because I still hadn't replaced my curtains, additional fines had accumulated, and the association was considering placing a lien against my property if payment wasn't received promptly. I laughed again, but this time there wasn't any humor in it. I carried the letter straight to Michael's office. He barely glanced at it before sliding it into our evidence binder. "Good," he said. "They just strengthened our case." "How?" I asked. "Because they're escalating enforcement while we're actively disputing the legitimacy of the violation. Judges don't usually appreciate that." Hearing that settled my nerves more than I expected. Still, the night before court, I barely slept. I kept replaying every conversation I'd had with the board, wondering if I'd somehow overlooked something that would make me look unreasonable. My wife found me sitting on the porch before sunrise with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. She wrapped a blanket around my shoulders even though it wasn't that chilly. "You nervous?" she asked. I admitted I was. She smiled. "You're not fighting over curtains anymore. You're fighting because somebody thought they could bully people into staying quiet." That perspective changed everything. The courthouse itself was surprisingly ordinary. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, people carrying folders and drinking vending machine coffee. Nothing about it felt dramatic until the board members walked through the front doors. Linda Mercer entered first, wearing a tailored navy suit and heels that clicked sharply across the marble floor, followed by the association's attorney and 2 other board members, who looked as confident as executives arriving for a business presentation. Linda caught my eye from across the hallway, smiled politely, then said just loud enough for me to hear, "This could have all been avoided if you'd simply followed the rules." I smiled back. "Maybe," I answered, "if someone had bothered to tell me what the rules actually were." For the first time since this started, her smile disappeared. A few minutes later, we were called into the courtroom. And as everyone took their seats, I realized the next hour wasn't going to decide what color curtains belonged in my windows. It was going to determine whether the people running our community believed the rules applied equally to everyone, or only to the people brave enough to ask uncomfortable questions. The hearing moved faster than I expected, but every minute felt stretched out by the weight of what was sitting on that evidence table. The association's attorney opened by insisting the board had broad authority to preserve neighborhood aesthetics and that every homeowner, including me, had agreed to follow those rules when purchasing property. Linda Mercer sat beside him with her hands folded neatly, nodding every few seconds as if the outcome had already been decided. Then the judge asked the simple question that changed the entire atmosphere. Can you show me the written standard that tells homeowners which curtains are acceptable? The attorney shuffled through a binder, paused, then pointed to a single sentence in the governing documents about maintaining visual harmony throughout the community. The judge looked at it for several seconds before asking, "Is there a color guide?" "No, Your Honor." "Approved materials?" "No." "Photographic examples?" "No." The courtroom suddenly felt very quiet. Michael stood, walked to our table, and began laying out photograph after photograph across the evidence stand until it looked like a giant neighborhood map. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "every one of these homes displays curtains visible from public streets. Different colors, different fabrics, different styles. None of these homeowners received citations." The judge slowly examined the pictures, then compared them to the violation notice issued against me. "Why was Mr. Carter cited?" he asked. The association's attorney answered, "The Architectural Review Committee determined his home did not meet community standards." Michael didn't raise his voice. He simply handed over the spreadsheet and highlighted the 4 cited homeowners. These are the only 4 people cited in 5 years. Every one of them requested financial records or questioned association spending before receiving violations. We believe this wasn't architectural enforcement. It was retaliation disguised as architectural enforcement. I watched Linda's expression change for the first time since the hearing began. The confidence disappeared. She leaned toward her attorney and whispered something urgently while he flipped through papers that suddenly didn't seem very useful anymore. The judge tapped the spreadsheet with his pen, then looked directly at the board members. "Can you explain why these 4 homeowners were treated differently from everyone else?" Nobody answered immediately. Eventually, Linda cleared her throat and said, "The board has discretion when interpreting appearance standards." The judge nodded once, then replied with words I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Discretion is not permission for unequal enforcement. Rules that lack objective standards cannot be applied selectively against individuals. 15 minutes later, it was over. The court dismissed every dollar of the fines against me, ordered the violations removed from my homeowner record, and required the association to rewrite its architectural guidelines with clear, measurable standards before issuing any future citations related to window coverings. As we walked out of the courtroom, Michael smiled and quietly said, "Congratulations. You didn't just win your case. You changed how they'll have to govern." He was right. News spread through the neighborhood faster than I ever imagined. Within days, homeowners who had spent years quietly paying questionable fines started attending board meetings. They asked about landscaping contracts, legal invoices, reserve accounts, and enforcement policies. Questions that used to disappear into awkward silence were suddenly being answered in public. About a month later, Linda Mercer resigned as board president. The association elected new directors who hired an independent consultant to rewrite the architectural manual from scratch, complete with actual color references, material descriptions, and transparent review procedures. Ironically, when the new guide was finally published, my original beige curtains complied perfectly. I never replaced them. They're still hanging in my front window today, fading a little more each summer under the Nevada sun. And every time I pull them closed at night, they remind me that this story was never really about fabric or color. It was about what happens when ordinary people stop assuming authority is always right simply because it sounds official. Looking back, I don't hate my HOA. I don't even hate the people who ran it. I think power has a strange way of convincing people that small abuses don't matter because they're wrapped in paperwork and polite language. But small abuses have a habit of growing into bigger ones when nobody challenges them. If I paid the fine without asking questions, maybe nothing else would have happened. Maybe the next homeowner would have been targeted for something equally ridiculous. Maybe another family would have stayed quiet because fighting back seemed too expensive or too exhausting. I'll never know. What I do know is that one envelope sitting under my front door forced me to learn something my father used to tell me when I was a kid. Fairness isn't something you're given. It's something you're willing to stand up for, even when everyone else thinks it's easier to stay silent. So now I'd like to ask you something. If you were in my shoes, would you have paid the $800 just to make the problem disappear? Or would you have risked taking the fight all the way to court like I did? And do you think the board made an honest mistake? Or were they deliberately using vague rules to silence homeowners who ask too many questions? Share your thoughts in the comments because I genuinely love to hear where you stand. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and send it to someone who believes ordinary people can never beat a system that seems stacked against them. Sometimes they can, and sometimes it all starts with something as ordinary as a pair of curtains.